We're back on Yaffee Live here on the Talk Monster. This is Chattanooga Smart Talk Radio. Glad you're joining the show. And if you miss any of the show live, well, check out the podcast anywhere podcasts are available. There is a lot going on in the Tennessee General Assembly, a lot of bills making its way through committees or being killed in committees, and conservatives fighting for things and RINOs getting in the way. So we got to talk about that and more right now with Brandon Lewis. He is the founder of the Tennessee Conservative, which you can read every day at TennesseeConservativeNews.com. Brandon, how are you today, my friend?
I'm fantastic. It smells like pollen and freedom. I'm glad to be on this show.
Pollen and freedom. Oh, okay. I mean, I would prefer just the freedom part, but we can't avoid the pollen part. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. So first thing I want to talk to you about, right there on your website, there's a bill to close primaries in Tennessee, but it failed in Senate committee without receiving a vote, which is a little bit frustrating. But talk about this.
Yeah, this bill has been killed more times than a vampire on a Buffy episode. I mean, it has just been murdered repeatedly, and it didn't even get a vote, right? So Adam Lowe filed this bill to basically just require party registration. Now, what you will hear the RINOs say, even some of them locally here, is that, it's already against the law. You just got to get your poll watchers to look, and as if you can tell when somebody walks up and says Democrat or Republican ballot, there's any way to determine it if they are or aren't a member of our party. But further, Cody Wamp, our own district attorney, told the Chattanooga Times Free Press that people that crossover vote need not worry about her office doing anything about it. And so the combination of it really being hard to discover when it's happening and your own DA saying that if Democrats vote in Republican primaries, she won't do anything about it means essentially that the primaries are open in our state, and they have been. And so this has been brought again and again. And in this particular case, when the bill was brought, Richard Briggs, Paige Wally, Tom Hatcher, and our own Todd Gardenhire just wouldn't vote for it. And often what they will do is they don't vote for these bills, Yaffee, so that they don't, quote unquote, make it on their record as a vote. They just don't vote at all. And if the bill doesn't get a second and it doesn't get a vote at all, then it doesn't even get discussed. And so that's the way that this bill ended up being killed. And one of the senators, Richard Briggs, wrote back to one of his constituents who was outraged about this. And he said, frankly, I'm glad many Democrats crossed over and voted for Republican candidates, but he's also one of the most liberal ones in the state. And as I've often said, if you can't win a Republican primary without Democrats crossing over, you might just not be a Republican to begin with.
Yeah, that is a very revealing quote, because when you're like, I like that Democrats are voting for Republican candidates. Oh, you probably like that because you're not very conservative. So you want liberal Democrats to help you win a Republican primary.
That is exactly what happens. And you can see it when we looked during the convention at the database of people that are bona fide. You would see folks that are, this is so funny but sad, you would see people on this list, I kid you not, that are outspoken Democrats, like in our community, and they were bona fide to vote in the Republican primary. Jeez. Because that's all they do is crossover. To pick if you're in a Republican drawn district, I mean that's all you're going to do is cross over and vote for the least conservative of the two options, and so it's alive and well in Hamilton County. You can see it in the numbers.
I mean, you might as well just not have parties at that point, right? I mean, we have muddied the waters so much that it's like, well, the party doesn't stand for anything. Now, you can make an argument that sometimes it doesn't.
Not only does the party not stand for anything, if party leadership actually tries to hold elected officials accountable to vote with the platform, they're chastised by their own leaders or their own elected officials because they just want a cheerleading squad. They do not want an electorate that is active and informed.
Yep, I think you're right. Brandon Lewis is the founder of the Tennessee Conservative. We're talking about the latest dealings in the legislature, and this next story here is pretty interesting. Tennessee bill allowing school districts to deny enrollment to illegal students or charge them tuition, passed a Senate committee process. So I know we've talked about this before. There was one bill similar to this, right, that failed, and this is kind of a different version?
Yeah, the bill that failed essentially just cut off the funding at the state level. It was done, right? We're not going to do this, which is really what primary voters want. This bill is we're going to cut off the funding if the local LEA chooses, which would mean that our contingency of Republican school board members, which have control of the school board in Hamilton County, if they chose to do this, which they should, and their constituents would want them to, whether or not they're conservative enough to do it remains to be seen, and we'll see if this bill passes, if that's true. But they can vote to check citizenship, and if you don't meet the requirements, if you're not here legally, then you would have to pay tuition, which essentially would probably just de-enroll the majority of legal aliens we have in the school systems. And, one thing Bo Watson, who's to be congratulated and encouraged for doing this amid all the left-leaning pressure and RINO pressure that's coming his way, it's not only that we have the hard cost of the education, we've got additional staff that have to be brought on board to teach them English, and we have to have additional staff brought on board who speak Spanish during the interim. And so it's just very expensive when somebody comes into your school that's nowhere near grade level and doesn't speak the language.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like, well, yeah, we got to charge tuition because they're adding a lot of extra costs. It's a really good argument. So it sounds like you support this bill, even though it's kind of like it's good. It's better than nothing, was your argument?
Well, it's the only meaningful preventative bill, I think. Well, maybe one or two others that are kind of nibbling around the edges. That is not yet dead. It's like the last remaining good news for conservatives that care about this issue. There's a couple of others about NGOs, and then some that we may talk about here in a moment about voting and things of that nature. But those are really after the fact bills. They're not preventative, but there are a handful of preventative bills, not very strong. All the good, strong bills like the Trump Act and many of the others were killed by Republicans in committee.
Now, do you think because this one passed committee, so do you think it's going to pass everything eventually?
Yeah, I think it will.
Good.
Think it will. I've got high hopes for it, only because the Senate's very liberal on the Republican side. I mean, how could you bring a bill just to make sure Republicans are voting in Republican primaries and not even get a second vote? I mean, it's a very liberal chamber, and they're really just Democrats that run as Republicans, most of them, and so we'll see what happens with it. But typically, if it makes it out of the Senate committee and if it makes it out of the House committee, if it makes it to a floor vote, we'll probably see the thing pass. At least I'm hopeful that that's what happens.
Brandon Lewis joining me with the Tennessee Conservative. I'm glad that you guys had this next story here because I first heard about it yesterday, and I still need to dig into it a little bit more. But your headline here says, sneaky caption bill stripping local GOPs of caucus rights, and that passed a Senate committee. So talk about what's in this bill and what your thoughts are on it.
So every county GOP, this is getting a little wonky, has the ability to hold a caucus for an election. Typically, they are used for seats that are vacated. For example, like it costs a whole lot of money for a rural county to run a special election when a replacement state rep, state senator, or something like that could be chosen. And so it makes sense. And then some counties actually elect their officials that way. Some of the small rural counties, the county officials. And so it's been in the bylaws for, 100 years. 150 years. It's like a time-honored tradition. Well, what has happened is Lee Reeves and Jack Johnson specifically, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to flip the Williamson County GOP, and they lost to grassroots people that spent very little, and they are worried probably now that they have poked that bear that GOP may decide to have caucuses. And so what they're trying to do is to get all the state reps and state senators to basically, stick their thumb in the eye of their own people back in their own county. And so the only thing I can think of that might stop this from passing is if they wise up and realize that, they're going to make Jack Johnson and Lee Reeves their problems back in their home county, and even if they don't have problems back in their own county. And so, but I don't know that this will stand constitutional muster, because not only did Lee Reeves put what's called a severability clause on it, because often you see severability clauses, as getting nerdy, put on these bills when they're like, I don't think this is going to pass constitutional muster. This will probably be struck down, because the government really doesn't have any ability to regulate how private parties choose their candidates. I mean, they're a separate organization. You run as a Republican. It has nothing to do with government. It's its own entity. It's its own organization. It's a political organization. So in the end, I don't know that this thing will actually will stay together, which just, again, and for me, just looking at this from a political perspective, purely political, I'm like, okay, not only are we going to make everybody mad back in our home counties, even if they don't have a beef with us, the thing may get overturned, in which case what I found is typically if you take something away from people and then it gets given back to them, they definitely use it then.
So, okay, so I understand the constitutionality, but I guess my question, the argument, I'm just trying to understand, because you're right, it gets a little nerdy in the weeds, but the argument is that sometimes they need to do it through a caucus instead of a primary because it can get a little expensive. For them to do it? It
can get expensive, and then the other thing is it's just in their purview. That's how the bylaws are written, and so this is basically the state government telling a private organization, you must select your candidates in this fashion. And I think it's very telling that Scott Golden, who's really never stood up to leadership on any issues ever, to my knowledge, he did testify to close the primaries, and it fell on deaf ears. And the CEC, the SEC, the State Executive Commission, or Council, has voted again and again, urging lawmakers to close the primaries through a registration process, and they've never done it. They've just ignored them. And so, Scott's a yes man through and through. And you would think that if for no other reason than standing up for his own party's autonomy, he would have raised hell about this, but he didn't. And so it's very sad when the party doesn't mean anything, when the party is just essentially a fan club for the politicians, regardless of how conservative they are or aren't.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. Very interesting. I think there'll be a debate on that in the future, but you're right. The constitutionality of that one part, getting rid of caucuses, because I've heard arguments pro and against on that, and I hadn't known too much about it until like yesterday. So it's very interesting. But I think you make a good point that we're talking about basically a private organization, and for them to say, well, they have to do it this way, could cause some problems.
It's the same situation you had, like it or dislike it, with RFK not being allowed to run against Joe Biden. It was a decision that the party made. Mm-hmm. And they have unilateral authority to do it. If parties wanted to select their candidates by spinning a bottle, they could do it. I mean, it's left up to them to do it. And so they're saying that everything must be chosen through a primary. And so they've been getting a lot of pushback, but I don't know that this particular class of folks in the General Assembly will really listen until they're kicked out of office. I don't think they care what the grassroots or constituents or GOP primary voters think. And so we're going to have a battle royale in 2026 to try to move the the General Assembly, in a more conservative direction.
Well, and I guess the final question I have on this is, okay, let's say this bill doesn't pass. Could the state party regulate it if they wanted to, like from this?
Yes, they could change their own laws and their own bylaws, so they could do that at any time. They could change it now. Like, for example, and people don't think about this for closing the primaries, and this is what I would do if I were the GOP chair in Tennessee. I would just create my own party registration system, and you would have to register with the party, and I would figure out a way to make sure that folks knew how to do it, and I'd work with the government on it. And, you can do, there are some states that the registration is done through the party and not the election commissions. So if there was a political will to close the primaries at any time, it could be done. There's just no will in it because a lot of these Republicans absolutely depend on Democrat votes to get in, and then they get in and vote like Democrats. And so that's one reason, we've been doing this a while now, Yaffee, and you can go research it on your own. You don't have to take our publication's word for it. I mean, this is just how it is in the state of Tennessee, and it's a reality and a truth most Republicans don't even know.
Brandon Lewis, he's the founder of the Tennessee Conservative. Read these stories and much more right there, TennesseeConservativeNews.com, and you should definitely subscribe for their newsletter as well. Brandon, appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.